the second of our classes on the canon of Scripture. Bella is passing them out. And Susan would say that I'm in what is called an annoying mood this morning because I feel good. I feel great, and I love to tease her, but I feel good and great.
Yeah, he was singing in the shower. Man.
Yeah, I
I was trying to sleep.
There's a visual for you.
Well, it's like those old Mario Lanza movies, you know, I just break into song. Today is the second of our classes. This is a three-part series on how we got our Bible. Last week, and I think there may be some of last week's bulletins left over there. If not, we can always make more. But last week we covered what is inspiration, canonization, transmission, translation, what the Bible is written on, papyrus, parchment, this, that, tablets, when it was written, the languages of the Bible. So last week we sort of did the theology and the practicality. And this week we're going to basically look at the Old Testament, where it came from, how it was preserved, and how we read it today. In 2 weeks, we're going to do the New Testament. Next week, Ann Patz is with us. She's come from Germany, and so we'll have this time devoted to her presentation on her missionary work among trafficked women in the brothels of Hamburg, Germany. I always like Ann's line that she has been to every brothel in Hamburg. I always think that's a great way to start a cocktail party. I know a girl who's been to every brothel in Hamburg, Germany. So I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to refer to it to sort of keep me on track so I don't go down any rabbit holes. I put in footnotes if you have interest in going deeper into this topic, where I got this information. Remember, I have nothing original. I just have studied, and this is what I come up with. So if I screw up, blame it on somebody else.
It's Art's fault.
It's Art's fault. Now, I think the question that we would ask is, why does it all matter? What is the significance of canonicity? And I've got a quote at the bottom of the first page. If the scriptures are indeed inspired by God, then last week we talked about what inspiration meant. Just as an aside, someone like Michelangelo or Caravaggio, they had inspired, their artwork is inspired. Caravaggio can murder people and still paint pictures that give glory to God. Moses murdered a man, he murdered an Egyptian, yet he still was used by God, and the scriptures are inspired. Moses wasn't inspired, the scriptures Moses wrote were inspired. Paul wrote scriptures that were inspired, but Paul himself was a human being, a sinner with flaws and everything. So, which books are inspired? Historically, it was important for the people of God to determine which books God had inspired and which were authoritative. In other words, we needed the Bible to tell us. My brother Fred has picked both. My wife Susan was reading in the beauty parlor this magazine about Jesus. Do you remember when the Da Vinci Code fad? Yeah. About 10, 15 years ago, and Jesus really was secretly married and had a wife, Mary Magdalene, and they ran away and moved to, I don't know, Palm Springs and something like that. How can we say with absolute certainty that's fiction? And how can we say that the accounts in the Bible narrative are inspired by God? That's the question the early Christians had, because there was no central publishing house. There was no central group that you could always call Orlando and say, can we do this? You basically had these different things floating around, and it took time to sort out what was good and what was garbage. So the first is the difference between inspiration and canonicity. Now, I'm a canon of a cathedral. That is spelt with one word. A cannon as a gun is spelt with two N's. And the canon that we're speaking about is spelt the same way as my ecclesiastical title. And just as an aside, my title derives from the job of the man in the cathedral to read scripture. It became an honorary title over time. But the canon is a rod, or it's a staff, it's a measuring stick. And over time, the canon began to refer to the authoritative grouping of something. The canon of Shakespeare, the canon of literature, the canon of the Bible. In other words, it's used religiously, but it's also used in other ways to describe something. This is the fixed universe on this topic. So that's where that comes from. And in the early church, that's sort of how they described it. And I'll read a quote here from F.F. Bruce. In the Christian context, we might define the word as the list of the writings acknowledged by the church as documents of the divine revelation. So, this course is about those things that the church universally calls inspired by God. Now, who determines which books are canonized? And, well, I'll give you the pious answer. God does. It's our job to discover it. Now, that may sound a little artsy-fartsy. Well, God is determining canonization, but it's our job to discover it. What does that mean? It's the same way with science. God created the world. He created the universe. The scientist's job is to study the universe, and from his studies bring forth medicine, physics, all these things. In other words, it's already out there. And so part of the job of the church is to take these writings and be able to discern, okay, what is breathed by God? In other words, what is this thing that's just appeared before us, and it looks good, it smells good, but how can we really tell it's from God? And we use our discernment. So what we're doing is, we have God sort of breathes life into these scriptures, but it's the job of the church and the job of the people over the course of time to say, this passes the smell test, this doesn't. And what we're going to do next week, for 2 weeks, is how, like, the Gospels, as soon as they were done, they were canonized. I mean, everybody knew they were right. Revelation took about 300 years because, ooh, this stuff's a little squirrely, I don't know. So you see, the different things were different at different times. Now, so canonicity is discovered by mankind. So we shouldn't confuse the two. Now, I want to talk about some false views, which I call false. People who hold them think they're true, but you get my editorial opinion. Just being old doesn't mean you're right. There was an old argument that antiquity does not determine its authority. One German scholar believed all the books composed after Malachi's time were excluded from consideration. Thus he believed all the Jewish books before Malachi were canonical. Well, that basically puts God on a linear calendar timeline, and there are many books that are older than some of the books of the Bible that are not considered canon. And we hear about these in the Bible itself. In Joshua, we hear about the book of Jasher. In Numbers, the book of the wars of the Lord. And we have the books of the Jewish apocalypse. So these things that were just as old as First Kings, Second Things, this and that, within the life of the Jewish church before Christ, they threw them out. They say, no, this doesn't pass the test. In other words, these were written, but it was the believing community over time that said, no, I'm sorry, we're not adding the book of Jasher. Even though it's mentioned in the Bible. Oh, well, if it's mentioned in the Bible, it's got to be good. Well, Paul cites Greek philosophy in the New Testament. Does that mean Greek philosophy's right? No, he's just saying, well, these people would say X as an example of the point he's arguing against. And so just because it's mentioned doesn't make it magic, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Well, many of the canonical books were received in the canon shortly after they were written. Now, and a lot of these, we sort of get the answers from the Bible itself. For instance, Moses' work, traditionally, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, were written by Moses, except for the very end of Moses, which says Moses died. Joshua, we understand, wrote the end of Deuteronomy, and then the book of Joshua. But even in Deuteronomy, we read that some of the books that Moses was writing at the time were already accepted by the Jewish people, the Hebrew children, as valid scriptures. So the first 5 books of the Bible, as they came off of Moses' pen, boom, were immediately accepted. And Peter, in Peter's letters, refers to Paul, St. Paul's letters. So Paul's letters, as soon as they were done, boom, the church saw them as being, breathed through the Spirit of God. God was speaking through the pen of St. Paul. So some of these things, boom, happened right away. Another was Hebrew language determines canonicity. This is another German. Said that anything written in Hebrew must be true. Well, that's not necessarily so. There are other books that were rejected even though they were written in Hebrew. That it agrees with the Torah and determines canonicity. The Torah, though, is not the standard of canonicity. Plus, Jewish fathers believe their Talmud and Midrash agreed with the Torah, but they never believed to be canonical. The Torah is the Jewish Old Testament, and if it agrees with the Old Testament, it must be true. Well, the Jews, just as our New Testament was being created, what we call modern Judaism created the Midrash and the Talmud. And these agree with the Old Testament, but just because they agree with them, they're not on the same level as the Old Testament for Jewish believers. Do you understand the distinction? They don't contradict, but they're just commentaries and explanations. And so no rabbi today would say the Talmud is just like Exodus. I mean, in authority. We use the Talmud, we study the Talmud, we argue with the Talmud, but it's not the Torah or the Old Testament. Another is the church determines canonicity. There's a problem with that because you can have squirrely leaders in the church. When I was a young priest, actually it was in seminary, the Bishop of Pennsylvania came to my parents' church, which had sponsored me in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And my father was a very quiet man. He wasn't demonstrative. He got up in the middle of one of Charles Bennison's sermons when the bishop came and said, "You, sir, are a liar." Middle of the sermon, and my mother had heart failure because you don't interrupt a bishop. Well, the bishop had said the church can write the Bible, the church can change the Bible. This is Bishop of Philadelphia saying this. And my father was so incensed by this, and I don't think Bishop Bennison had ever been interrupted before, that it cut short a sermon. So the problem is, which part of the church? In other words, you get into difficulties because not everything that's done in the name of the church is done properly. We can see so many examples through our history, in our denomination and other denominations. I like to tell the story. You go up to the old churches, Episcopal churches in New York City and in Boston and Philadelphia, especially in South Carolina, and many of them have balconies. And what were they called until modern times? Slave galleries. Why? Because whites would sit downstairs and blacks would sit upstairs. And they had enforced segregation in the building. We look at that and we're horrified. But that just was the way the church was. You go to South Africa, and until recently, the Dutch South African church, during the apartheid era, said it was God's will that the white man have dominion and the black man be a servant. And they pointed to the story of Noah's Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And one of them was to be a hewer of wood and carrier of water and servant for his brothers. And they said, well, this one is the father of the white race, this is the father of the Asian race, this is the father of the African race. The African race are to be hewers of wood and carriers of water and servants to the others. Therefore, that means we should take the black man's land and basically live in servitude. This was a Christian church that sort of forgot that in Christ there is no Greek nor Jew, slave nor free. So the church can and will make stupid mistakes. And so just because the church says it so, we can't always stop our brains from thinking. So God determines whether a book is inspired and thus canonical, and churches and councils do not. Men do not determine which books are canonical. God does. God gives the book of the Bible their divine authority. God's people recognize this authority, but they don't determine its authority. J.I. Packer, he's 94 or 5. He's probably the greatest living Anglican, he's Canadian, Bible scholar, writing in English, who's alive today. So J.I. Packer is one of us, if you will. The church no more gave us the New Testament canon than Sir Isaac Newton gave us the force of gravity. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. In other words, Isaac Newton described gravity. He discovered gravity. He discerned gravity, one of the laws of nature God had put into place. The church didn't write the Bible. It discerned these scriptures were God's through the testing and prayer and whatnot. So do you see this sort of distinction? And it may be a fine line or a fine split, fine hair there. But I think it's, well, if you don't have that fine hair, you can get into trouble.
Statues in the stone.
Hmm?
The statue is in the stone.
Yes, yes. The books of the canon the books of the Bible become canon the moment they're written. They don't need to wait for the church's sanction to become a canon. They were the canon the moment they were written. I already said that. This view confuses the two related but separate issues: the church's canon's nature, determination, and the canon's discovery. Scholar James White uses an example. I've written 8 books. The action of my writing these books creates the canon of my works. If a friend of mine does not have an accurate or full knowledge of how many books I have written, does that mean there's no canon of my books? No, of course not. In fact, if I was the only one who knew how many books I had written, would that mean the canon of my books did not exist? The point is clear. The canon is one issue and comes from God's action of inspiring the scriptures. Our knowledge of the canon is another. Our knowledge can grow and mature as it did at times in history. The canon is not defined by us, nor is affected by our knowledge or ignorance. So that sort of sets the stage of where we're going to start with the Old Testament. And does anybody want to have any thoughts before we jump into sort of the next section of who gets to decide, how it's decided, what inspiration is, what discernment is? A lot of this we did last week, but there is no, in our world, the Protestant world, the Episcopal world, there is no one person with whom the buck stops. We don't have what is called a magisterium. In other words, the magisterium in the Catholic Church is the traditions as interpreted by the Pope. The buck stops with the Pope. They're having arguments right now within the Catholic Church that are causing liberals and conservatives to really go at each other, that have made the Episcopal wars of the past 25 years look like pea-shooter wars. Pope Francis on Wednesday is going to announce whether or not they're going to change the rules on married priests. And he's also expected to say whether or not we'll have female deacons. And if you have female deacons, there's no reason why you can't have female priests. And if you can't have female priests, there's no reason why you can't have female bishops. John Paul II said, no women clergy. But Francis can turn that around. Now, who can do that? Francis can do that. In the Episcopal work, how does it work? The bishop can say what he likes. Do I have to believe it? I have to smile when he says it. Do I have to believe it? No, I don't. What do I have to believe? The creeds, the scriptures. And I must follow his leadership in things that are lawful and temporal. But the bishop is not bishop doesn't stand between me and God. Only Jesus Christ stands between me and the Father. So that's the Protestant worldview. And so we operate on consensus. And the disadvantage of consensus is that it takes forever to get anything done. I mean, let's take an issue, slavery. You know, Georgetown University, which was founded by Jesuits, is going through all these sort of political correctness things, because Georgetown University owned slaves up until 1860. 61. Then the Pope said, can't have slaves anymore. Okay. Protestants in the United States fought a civil war. Mostly Protestants fought a civil war over this. And the Baptists split in the Southern Baptists and the Northern Baptists, Southern Methodists, regular Methodists, Presbyterians, Southern Presbyterians. Episcopal Church decided to wait to see who won the war. But it took a war and generations for everybody to eventually come to the point that slavery was evil. Whereas in the Catholic Church, you can turn on a dime. Now, the problem with turning on the dime is that you really upset a lot of people, because what they had basically based all their thinking on is now no longer the case. Now, I'm oversimplifying things, so please don't hear me to say that the Pope can be mercurial. He too is constrained by tradition and things like that. But the Protestant, you just, in the contrast, the Catholic Church has a more defined authority. The Protestant Church has a more consensus-driven authority. So it's taken a generation for women clergy not to be really an issue among most mainstream Protestant groups. It may be for individuals, that's fine. That nobody's saying you can't be or you're wrong for that. But we've moved from a consensus position over the course of time. And that's just how the difference. Now, and so with the Bible, it was sort of the same way. We had immediate acceptance of some things in the church or in the synagogue, and then it's some other stuff that, you know, this book of Revelation is really wild, I don't know. And it took 300 years of finally having everybody say, yeah, I hear God's voice, I hear God speaking, I know His Spirit is present here. So does anybody have a yes on it?
I feel that God's pretty smart. The biggest thing He's done is put the right people in the right place at the right time.
Church one.
The mixes could be anybody except what you needed at the time. They're no different than the founding fathers. Great bunch of minds. They're in the right place at the right time. People who set the Bible up, right place at the right time. God's got a plan. All you gotta do is just quit fighting it.
And sometimes not sometimes, many times, a number of times in the course of church history, it's the clergy who've been wrong. In the 3rd and 4th century, we had the Arian controversy, where the vast majority of bishops adopted what we now call the Arian heresy, which I'm not going to go into because it's a class in itself. And just a few bishops and the people said, no, 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 no. And in essence, the bishops lost. The minority party in the bishops group lost, and the majority of people worshiping the pews said, no, we're not going that way. In the 1960s in the Church of England, you had a lot of these sort of fancy bishops who would talk about, well, I don't necessarily believe in the virgin birth and the resurrection and God is dead. And you know what? People still went to church and they bitched and moaned, and no bishops were not appointed who talked that way. Because you understand that the people who pay the bills, who fill the churches, they have the power of the purse, they have the power of their voice, they have the power of their feet.
Right people, right time, right pew.
I have to say that I don't think that if the Catholic Church were faced with bankruptcy in the United States, with all the abuse things and people moving out because they're mad, I don't think they would change as quickly to straighten up things. Now, that's unkind, I admit that. But I think people, the lay people in the church, who we teach in the Protestant tradition, are ministers of the gospel also. Listen to my sermon in an hour's time. Lay people are ministers of the gospel just as much as bishops and priests are. And we sometimes forget that because we defer to authority. Now, often that's the right thing to do, but sometimes it's a big mistake. Let's jump in to the Old Testament. Now, the 24 books recognized as canon in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, we number, in English, 39. What's the difference? Well, some of them, they put together. 1st and 2nd Kings are one book. First and Second Chronicles, another book. They combine books. Ezra and Nehemiah are one book. So we chop it into 39 bits. The Jews have it in 24. And they divide it into 3 bits. The law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which is written by Moses. The prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, Malachi, things like that. And then the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, they go all across the place. Some are history, some are prophecy, some are poetry. And the origin of the 3-section division came about in the 2nd century, when it was referred to in the prologue of Sirach in about 130 BC. So that division, and so by Jesus' time, that division, the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So that was the common understanding in Jesus' time. And a progressive collection of Old Testament prophecy books. From the beginning, the inspired writings of the Old Testament were collected by the Jews and revered as sacred and divinely authoritative. Moses put the Book of the Covenant, including the 10 Commandments, into writing, and the people agreed to obey it. We read that in Exodus. So, if you will, the very first canonical scripture were the 10 Commandments, in stone, carried down, and it all developed from there. The book of Deuteronomy was stored in the Ark of the Tabernacle after Moses wrote it, and later, with the rest of the laws, it was moved to the temple built by Solomon. Joshua added his words and set them up in the sanctuary of the Lord. And I just have other Old Testament quotations that show that over the course of the time, as these things came into writing, as they came into being, they passed the sniff test for the Jewish people, and they included them in their canon. And I won't go through each one. I've messed up my pages now. And so that in the prophetic community, it's the picture of Moses holding the tablets over his head. We have sort of a sense of who wrote what. And this did a lot. Moses, the Pentateuch, Joshua, Samuel, the history of David, Nathan, Ahijah, and Iddo wrote the history of Solomon, so on and so forth. And this is all stated within the Old Testament itself. Unnamed prophets wrote about Manasseh's reign. Jeremiah wrote, and Daniel and Ezekiel continue the prophetic ministry. Ezra, Nehemiah, and each of these prophets continued to this growing selection. Now, what made them think these things, as they came off the press, were worth stating as being canonical scriptures? Tradition. The established tradition that many of the books came from Moses or one of the other acknowledged prophets. So the authority is based on the author. The spiritual authority of the books themselves, as they were used in public or private meetings and exposition. In other words, they used these things, and they saw that it worked. It connected, it had meaning, it had purpose, it just wasn't some crazy thing. A recognition of the temple as sacred, and the conviction of leaders and people. And in other words, the people who were, if you will, the readers of the Bible, the subjects of the preaching and teaching, they said, yes, this is agreeable with our conscience, with our innate common sense. We may not like some of the stuff, but rather commit adultery and steal, but nonetheless we know just by in our intrinsic selves, this is God's word. Now, Jesus and the apostles, for Christians, there was the additional consideration that Jesus himself and his apostles often refer to the Jewish scriptures in general and to many of the individual books as having the authority of God. So for the Christian reading the Old Testament, we see Jesus talking about all of these things and treating them with a degree of reverence and understanding that these are my Father's words. Now, Moses wasn't my father, but Moses was the author, divinely inspired, to give us these words. So we have Jesus' own words, and Paul's and Peter's, and all these things. So for the Christian, we have not only the internal evidence of the Old Testament, we have the evidence of the New Testament. Now, the last of the Old Testament books that was canonical is Malachi. And why do we say this? Well, let's step outside the Bible and look at some of the evidence. Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century. And he wrote the Hebrew Old Testament was complete with no more writings were composed after the reign of Artaxerxes, which was in Malachi's time. From Artaxerxes until our time, everything has been recorded but has not been deemed worthy of credit like what had preceded, because the exact succession of prophets ceased. For though so long a time has now passed, no one has dared to add anything to them or to take anything away from them or to alter them and anything in them. So what Josephus is saying is that for 400 years after Malachi, people were writing stuff. But the Jewish community said, the Spirit is not speaking anymore. People are writing and they're good to read and, let's take a Christian example. C.S. Lewis, wonderful author, great stuff. I read him with pleasure and inspiration. Is he on the par with the Bible, the New Testament? No, he's not, because the Spirit isn't, stopped in that sense. Some German critics claim that portions of Scripture, such as Daniel, Ecclesiastes, and blah, 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 were compiled many years after Malachi, and they offer different arguments, technical arguments, but according to Josephus, writing in the 1st century, though no additional material was ever included, Josephus says the Jewish tradition was nothing was added. So people will say, oh, well, this really must date from the 1st century and is just added in by some scribe. That was against the common wisdom that Josephus wrote in his book. So could be, but it would then go against the external evidence that we have. Now, and in the Talmud, which I mentioned earlier, which is the commentaries of the modern Judaism that sort of arose in the first few centuries of the new post-Jesus, the Talmud says, after the later prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Holy Spirit departed from Israel. And in the New Testament, never quotes any Old Testament book as authoritative after the time of Malachi. So, here's what we've got right now. We have Jesus not citing Maccabees or Enoch or any of these Jewish writings that came after Malachi. Nobody does in the New Testament. We have the Jewish religion that stayed in the synagogue, saying nothing after Malachi is inspired by God. So essentially, that doorstop was accepted by both Jews and Christians. Everything halts after Malachi, and we're not going to add anything to it.
And wasn't after Malachi, wasn't that called like the 400 years, the quiet time or something like that?
Yes, the intertestamental time.
Intertestamental time.
It wasn't quiet. I mean, lots of stuff were happening, but the Spirit was quiet. God's Spirit was not at work in the world. I'll give you a sort of a modern example. There was something that happened in the United States called the Great Awakening, and it began in New England. After the American Revolution, Christianity was deader than it is today. Really, I mean, people just had, I'm done with that. I mean, they were as secular-minded, and for instance, there was, Yale University would turn out ministers for the churches of New England, and in 1 year they only had one graduate. Because nobody wanted to be, nobody's going to do it. And then we had people like Wesley and the Methodists in the South, and the Revivalists in the North, and all of a sudden, I may have my date wrong, it might have been before the Revolution, but whatever it was in the 1700s. All of a sudden, we had an awakening of the Spirit that ran for 40 or 50 years, that culminated in the great camp meetings and the revival teachings that broke out all across the United States of really. Now, there are some funny things. This is the time that the Mormons showed up. You get, some little squirrely things happening off here. Yes, but at the same time, religion the America that we sort of thought existed, of being a very religious place where people are learning to read by reading their Bible and stuff, that's not always been so. And people would say the Spirit is now back in the churches of the United States, in England. And in England you read about something called the Welsh Revival. And every so often you read about Scottish revivals and Irish revivals where the church is dead, and then for some reason, boom, it just takes off.
You know, you watch them on TV all the time, they romanticize the Western, but people were walking around with a gun in their hand, killing each other. And then I think what really started a lot of that was the Salvation Army, hoover bands.
Circuit riders.
And another thing, the most powerful religious movement of the second half of the 20th century, and right now most powerful, began on Azusa Street in Los Angeles, California. It's the Pentecostal movement. Pentecostalism, I think, give me plus or minus 10 years. In 1960 or 1970, Brazil was 90% Roman Catholic. Today, it's close to 50-50, with Pentecostal and Protestants being almost half and likely to be the majority within a generation. And it's not that the Catholic Church has just rolled up its shop and gone away, but rather people who, yeah, I'm Catholic because I guess that's my choice, because I'm Catholic, I'm a Brazilian, I'm Catholic. Born that way. The Pentecostal movements in South America and in parts of, Asia are just going through the roof. In our own Anglican Episcopal world, in 1900, I think there were 10,000 Anglicans in Nigeria. After the British left in 1962, there may have been 100,000. There are about 25 or 30 million today. There are more Episcopalians in Nigeria today. The three largest Episcopal or Anglican churches are Nigeria, Uganda, and Rwanda. Rwanda? I mean, come on now. I mean,
Can you point to it?
can you find Rwanda? Yes. There's, in other words, Uganda and Rwanda have millions upon millions of Anglicans, and at the same time, the Catholic Church has gone through the roof in these places, and the Pentecostals. It went from being basically local tribal religions to, it really is phenomenal. And I share this. One of I get a magazine called Voice of the Martyrs, which is a periodical that talks about Christian martyrs. And the two places the church is growing fastest in the world right now, two places. China, where it's basically illegal to be a Christian. What's happening? More people are becoming Christians. Iran, where if you convert to, if you leave Islam, you're likely to wind up in jail. And Algeria. When the French left Algeria, they had Catholic cathedrals all over Algeria that were built in the 30s, 40s for the French Algerians. When they left, the buildings were empty. The buildings are still empty, and when the French left in the early 60s, there were maybe, I think it was like 1,000 Algerian Arab Catholics. Today, they're estimated to be 250,000 Christians. They're not Catholics.
Not Catholic?
They're not Catholics. They're Pentecostals, they're Baptists, they're home church groups. Yes?
When I was in Honduras, I would constantly be asked how many people did we baptize, because bringing new people into the Christian church, we baptized very, very few. But we, because everybody was born and they were baptized as Catholic, okay? And then, but they never lived that religion. So Dagoberto started classes on your baptismal vows. What does it mean? and brought them to the point of being confirmed. And I was traveling with Bishop Allen up, I thought we were in Guatemala, but he insisted we were still in Honduras because we were way up in the mountains. And when the bishop goes into a church, I think they do it here as well, it says, those who would like to be confirmed, please stand up. And everybody in that church stood up. There were 94 confirmations that day. We didn't baptize anybody that day, but we brought 93 people into the realization of what God was asking of them. And that was the whole mission when I was there, of establishing partnerships between churches in Central Florida and churches in Honduras to help them build their religion. It, like Paul says, you know, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and that's what we were helping them do. Because they were all baptized, but we were helping them work out their salvation.
See, so where, I want to sort of, I got a late start this morning, so I'm trying to hurry. We mustn't poo-poo the power of the Spirit. I do not understand why it works when it works. I wish I knew where the button was to push it and just have everything just take off. I don't know where that button is. But it's happened, and I've seen it happen in other places. And one of the fruits of the power of the Spirit, we've talked about revival and new birth and revelation and new conversions. Part of the power of the Spirit is bringing the church together, as Art says, the right people at the right place, or the right communities, all saying, yes, this is God's Word, and throwing out stuff and keeping stuff. So, you know, some people would roll their eyes when I said at the beginning of the class, canonicity was determined by God, but it's men and women who've discerned it. That's really what I'm talking about. It's the Spirit moving through the Christian communities who say, this is, you know, breathed by God.
I think it's God's design.
Yeah.
And the people are wise, the ones that He put there are wise enough to listen. You don't change the Bible. It's by design very unchanging, very slow to move forward by design. If you had it changing every 5 minutes, Lord have mercy, you'd be well yellowed out. The same thing with our Constitution.
I would
It's
not
by
wear yellow. I don't
design.
look good in yellow.
Yeah, that's your color, huh?
No, I'd look like a giant stick of butter. I'm sorry. We've talked about, you know, Jesus and his companions and the apostles in the New Testament all spoke the same, you know, it ending with Malachi. You know, Luke, you know, we have the martyrs of the Old Testament, Jesus, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, when referring to martyrs. This first martyr in the Old Testament was Abel, the last martyr was Zechariah. In other words, Jesus is giving us confirmation. And Josephus, we have it from Jewish non-religious literature. And in 90 AD, there was the Council of Jamnia. Now in 72, the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And old-style Judaism of the religion of the priest at the temple was destroyed. The priesthood was destroyed. And Judaism passed under the leadership of the rabbis, the teachers of the law. They were no longer the priests, they were the teachers, the scholars. And they basically, in 90, had this Council of Jamnia. We're basically saying, what are we going to do now? In essence, they had, I don't want to say reinvent, because they weren't reinventing, but how do we have a temple worship when the Romans have flattened the temple? How do we go forward when we have so many of our people leaving for this Jesus movement? So the Council of Jamnia was the Jews sort of gathering, the rabbis gathering together and saying, okay, let's clear away all the dead brush. And one of the things they did in 90 AD was saying, these are the books that we consider canonical. It doesn't mean that they waited till 90, but they basically, in 90, got together and basically made a statement of what we affirm and believe. So we say the Pledge of Allegiance today, if you're in school, it doesn't mean we now believe it today. We believed it for however long has been around. But we affirm what we already exist. So you've got, by 90, the Jews had definitively closed off the Old Testament. And then the Christian churches as well had their own similar councils. We have Bishop Melito of Sardis, who in 170 was asked by one of his people to give an accurate statement of the ancient books as regards their number and their order. Melito did, and gave us a now famous list of the books of the Old Testament, except for Esther. This list matches today's Jewish and Protestant Old Testament. And we go through the 3rd and the 4th century. And so basically by the time of the Christian church taking off, everybody, Christian and Jew, agreed what was the Old Testament. Okay, well, what are these apocryphal books? Art mentioned the intertestamental period, and I've got some lovely Greek words that just as my showing off to you. You don't really need to remember those. But basically they're books accepted by all, books disputed by some, books rejected by everybody, and what was the final category? Books accepted by some. And the books rejected by all are pseudo-epigraphia. It was a common thing in those days. If you wanted to sell something, you give it another. It's like Star Trek fan fiction. If you want to be a science fiction writer and you try to sell a book to a publishing house, George Conger's latest science fiction book, nobody will buy it. But if you say to them, I've got another installment in Star Wars or Star Trek, people will publish that because, you know, you've got a ready market of people who like that stuff. So in the ancient world, it was not uncommon for people to write stuff and give authorship to somebody long dead and past. And so the church had a problem. What, is this another letter to, here's a letter from Paul to the Philadelphians. I never knew about this. And they read it, no, this isn't Paul.
He
But-
would argue with, he's dead.
He's dead. So
He's quiet.
the Jewish legend ascribes to Enoch 366 works. Ezra talks of 70 secret books. And some researchers of pseudo-epigrapha have listed more than 200 titles. Then we have some examples of them. Then we have the Apocrypha.
Could you pronounce those names of the arrangement, the Homo Lima?
Art? No.
No, I'm rooting.
Rudy.
This is art, for them who don't
No, as I said, I was doing that to show off. That doesn't mean I actually know what I'm talking about.
know. Okay, Apocrypha.
Apocrypha,
James,
Apocrypha.
on the next page. Okay.
Apocrypha.
Moving on.
Now, if you want to show off Delilah afterwards, I won't contradict however you pronounce it. Okay, let me talk about the.
I'll go along the line.
You got it there, we'll give it to you. He mumbled something that I'm not going to argue with. Okay. Now, there are two sets of apocryphas, a Protestant and a Catholic. What? Why do we have to have two sets? Why can't we just all agree? Well, it's because there were two sources. There's the books that were gathered by the rabbis and in Jerusalem and became known as the Palestine or Jerusalem Apocrypha, and those that were gathered in Alexandria. And there are a few extra in Alexandria. But basically, all the ones in Palestine are in Alexandria. Alexandria has a few more. These books were written after Malachi, and they were a source of harsh debate within the early church. Where do we put them? And the reason why, and I've got all the reasons why the Protestant reformers, people like Luther and Calvin, said, no. We want to keep them out, is that for some, they taught bad theology. Tobit, if you go to the chapel, you'll see a picture, an artistic painting of Tobit, and it's a man having his eye healed, and there's a little boy carrying a fish, and you go, what is this? It's a Bible story, it's from Tobit. Tobit teaches salvation by works. Martin Luther hated this book. And so guess what doesn't appear in the Lutheran Bible? Tobit. Well, when the Council of Trent met 30 years after Martin Luther hated Tobit, guess what the Catholics added? Tobit. It wasn't that, oh, Tobit, we've been worshiping and reading you for centuries. No, it was almost like, Luther, you don't like it? We're going to stick this and jab you.
Thumb in the eye.
So, and so you have some of these books that have Protestant Catholic polemical arguments, and I'm not smart enough to know to answer which is that. So what did the Episcopalians do? We put it in the middle, and we decided to do both a Catholic and a Protestant answer. The Catholics add them into the Old Testament, all but a few. Like there's a story called Bel and the Dragon that they add to the end of the book of Daniel. A Catholic Bible will have the story, I think it's a Daniel, but you have the end of Daniel, you have a dragon that is devouring people, and Daniel, and it's demanding offerings, and it's actually the priests of the temple of Baal are hiding inside the dragon statue and not actually eating. The dragon isn't eating these offerings, it's the priests eating them themselves. And Daniel proves to the king that, this is a fraud, and he gives it poison, and all the priests died. See, I told you so. That passage is in the Roman Catholic book of Daniel. That's moved to a standalone book of Bel and the Dragon in the Apocrypha. Now, in the Protestant Bible, it doesn't appear at all. But it's put in the Anglican, and at the very last page of and we have some additions: Judith, Tobit, Wisdom of Solomon, Baruch, I'm going to go to the very last page. Oh, I'm sorry. Very last part of that section, excuse me. We have what the Anglicans decided to do. Article 6 of our 39 Articles of Religion sets out what we call the Bible. And we have the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then we have this thing. And the other books, as Jerome, with a J, doth read for the example of life and instruction of manners, yet doth not apply them to establish any doctrine. So you get that? We're adding them to our Bible in between, and you can read them for entertainment, for manners, but you cannot get doctrine. So Tobit talks about salvation by works. Well, I'm sorry, you can read Tobit for a good story, but you can't make an argument about salvation from works from Tobit. So we decided to play it down the middle, do a both and. It's in our Bible, but you don't have to read it. Isn't that a wonderful Episcopal song?
You say it's in our Bible, which Bible? I'm sorry.
The King James Bible
King
and all the
James.
ones that sort of followed in that tradition
Half Tobit?
have Tobit in the Apocrypha.
Yeah, okay.
Some of them will stick it after the New Testament, after Revelation. Some will stick it in between. Now,
Wasn't that somewhat like ageless thing?
of what? Trying to cut it down the middle?
No, putting it in the Bible to begin with. You're kind of fooling with what was designed not to be fooled with.
Yes, but see, I will give you what they would say, or what I think they would say. See, we've given you a warning. Smoking does cause cancer, it will kill you. You can still buy these cigarettes, but it will kill you. So you can read you can read Tobit and enjoy yourself with that mild tobacco menthol flavor, but it will still kill you theologically.
But you wouldn't be bothered by it if you were in a Southern Baptist church,
Because,
because it won't happen.
First Baptist Church of Dallas, you'll never hear Pastor Carswell. Well, he's on TV all the time. You'll never hear him talk about Tobit or Enoch or Esdras other than to
Or
say
the
those,
Apocrypha,
or those.
yeah. It's just not there.
Now, I just want to close off by saying, how do we know, okay, we've decided what the topics of the books are. How do we know the ones that we're reading are the ones that they actually wrote? Well, we have manuscripts. Now, the oldest manuscripts we have still around. We have something in Leningrad called the Leningrad Codex. We have other things that date from 1000 AD that are actually pieces of paper that you can read. And so, basically, where's the gap? You know, we've got a gap of 1,000 years between when Jesus was alive and these books that the Jew, you know, that were put down as the Old Testament. How do we know somebody didn't fiddle with them? Well, over the course of over the centuries, we just assumed that this is what had been handed down. But here was the exciting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in 1948. They were written around the time of Jesus by the Essenes, who were a Jewish sect. They were sort of a puritanical sect. 95% match between what we have in our modern Old Testament and what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. And that 5% are things that are like minor, minor little things of no theological consequence, of, errors, struggle errors, things of that nature, singulars, plural, yes. So here's the one, that's why scholars, when they keep going on about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because what they found from the very time of Jesus, when we say it's done and everybody agrees there's nothing added, we've got those originals and 95% match between those originals and what we have today. And I may sound silly when I say this, but here's an example, I think, of the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, is it just, oh, la la la, God did a wonderful thing? Well, you'll see a little bit about how the Jews treated their scriptures. The scribes who recorded the Old Testament, they have very, very strict rules about how you do it. You had to take a bath before you did it. You had to pray before you did it. It had all these rules of behavior. And if you made one mistake and it was checked, the whole book that you worked on was pitched. So that's one of the reasons why there's so few copies, is because the only ones that were allowed were the perfect copies. It's not like Shepherd of the Hills Bulletin. Well, there are only 3 mistakes this week. Oh, we'll do it. Oh, why not? It doesn't matter. No, seriously, they just throw the whole thing out and just begin. But it's 7 minutes to showtime. Thank you all so very much. Next week, and Pat's.